The film begins with Jimmy, a former soldier, waking up to check on his baby daughter, who was born just a few months ago. Jimmy was happy at the start of this beautiful day, especially when the babysitter arrived, allowing him to leave for work. However, what Jimmy didn't know was that this would be the toughest day of his life. Shortly after, the work car arrives, and as he enters, he finds his older brother Mick along with the rest of the crew. In reality, work is a heist to steal over $1 million. Although Mick is the older brother, he is impulsive and loves to take risks, unlike Jimmy, who is calm and detail-oriented. When they arrive at the bank, everyone puts on masks and begins the break-in. The employees and customers are terrified and fear for their lives. Mick grabs the keys to the main vault from the manager and hands them to Jimmy, then threatens the manager and cuts off his little finger to force him to quickly give them the access code. The manager gives the code to Jimmy, but they suspect that it might be a panic button code. Under pressure from Mick, who keeps hitting him until he passes out, the manager finally provides the correct code. The gang quickly collects the money from the vault, then cautiously heads out. But before they can reach the car, the police arrive, and a massive shootout ensues. As it turns out, the police were already tipped off about the robbery. The battle is intense, with several police officers falling until reinforcements arrive, but the team manages to escape after taking out the police. During the escape, one of the crew members is wounded, and Mick takes the money bag from him. While another crew member dies, only Jimmy, Mick, and the injured man remain. They load him into the car, but the police pursue them. Mick leans out of the window, firing back at the police, eventually killing one of the officers. They stop at a location, change cars and clothes as part of their plan. Jimmy, still in disbelief over what has happened, realizes that there is a traitor among them. Mick plants a grenade in the old car and blows it up before they flee. Meanwhile, FBI agent Frank arrives and begins his investigation. Officer Nick informs him that a man named Smalls was recently arrested for cybercrimes, and after learning he would be facing 7 years in prison, Smalls decided to cooperate in exchange for his release. Officer Mike explains that the team that carried out the robbery had military training and were equipped with weapons and bulletproof armor. Frank goes to interview the bank employees for details, but they provide no useful information. Mike is instructed to investigate all details regarding the bank employees. In the meantime, the team arrives at the house of their friend Bill, where Mick beats him to confess that he is the traitor. However, Bill denies this and insists that Smalls is the one who betrayed them. Bill informs them that the person he works with refuses to handle the money after the killing of police officers, saying the situation has become too dangerous. Bill suggests they deal with a man named Nosy, who can launder the money for 50%. Suddenly, a furious woman enters the scene. Eva, a bank employee who also happens to be Jimmy's girlfriend. She confronts Jimmy, telling him she knew Mick would drag him into trouble, especially since they had recently paid for their daughter's surgery and their lives had improved. Jimmy calms her down and asks her to stick to the plan. Later, Mick suggests moving the injured man to another location, and Eva insists on going with them despite Jimmy's objections, though Mick agrees. On the other hand, Agent Frank confirms that the robbery was executed by former soldiers and is surprised to learn that this small bank held $1.5 million due to a transfer of funds during the renovation of the main branch. Frank decides to go and interrogate Smalls himself. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Mick reach a friend's house who used to be a doctor, trying to get medical help for the wounded man. Jimmy receives a call from Bill, informing him that Nosy will launder the money in exchange for 70% of the share. Even though the cut is significant, Jimmy agrees. After that, they head to meet Nosy's men. But before they do, Eva asks Jimmy when he'll return home, as she feels she might not see him again. He replies that he doesn't know when he'll be back, but he plans to escape to Bolivia, and she and their daughter will join him later so they can be together. Ava insists that they need to be alone, away from Mick. Later, they go to meet Nosy's men to exchange the money and get legal cash they can spend without being tracked. However, Mick notices that the money is short. Brill, Nosy's brother, tells him that this is their 30% share. Of course, Mick is surprised, and Jimmy explains that he agreed to the deal because they didn't have any other option. Brill speaks rudely and tells them that backing out isn't allowed. Suddenly, Mick pulls out his gun and kills the 3 men in front of him. while Jimmy takes care of the others, though one of them manages to escape. Mick kills Brill. Eva quickly drives the car to get them away. The man who escaped calls Nosy to inform him of what happened. Nosy orders him to hide, indicating that things are going to get worse for everyone. On the other hand, Agent Frank and his team begin interrogating Smalls to get to the truth. Smalls tells them that he was forced to help with the robbery and that if he told anyone what happened, they would kill him and his family. Of course, they don't believe him, and Frank threatens him with a life sentence because 6 officers were killed, meaning the punishment will be very severe. In the end, Smalls decides to cooperate with them. When they ask him about the people who asked for the information, Smalls says they were 2 brothers, but he doesn't know their names. He mentions that the younger one was focused on the details, while the older one was aggressive and constantly threatening. He adds that the younger brother wore a necklace with a St. Jude medallion, and the older one had a tattoo on his arm. When they ask him about the tattoo, he says it was a US Navy tattoo with the name Sheridan. At this point, Nick is surprised by the name and asks his assistant to look into something. Later, the assistant sends him 2 photos on his phone, and Nick shows them to Smalls. Smalls immediately identifies them as Mick and Jimmy. Nick informs Agent Frank that Sheridan is the family name of Mick and Jimmy, and that they had previously been arrested for assault and battery. Frank orders that their photos be broadcast on television. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Mick arrive at Bill's house. Bill is furious when he learns they killed Nosy's brother. Jimmy then tells his brother Mick that if they survive this mess, each of them will go their separate ways and never meet again. Naturally, Mick is puzzled and doesn't understand why Jimmy is saying this. Jimmy explains that all the problems he's faced were because of Mick, and that this is the best solution. Mick becomes angry and tells Jimmy and Eva that he's going to help them pay for their daughter's surgery because they are family. Jimmy recalls the times he was beaten by their father for defending Mick, but he remains firm in his stance. Mick tells him that this isn't his opinion, but Eva's, and that he can't believe he's choosing a woman like her over his brother. Jimmy loses his temper and asks him who he's insulting, to which Mick replies that he's talking about Eva. A fight breaks out between them, and suddenly Nosy's men burst in with weapons, as Bill had called them. Meanwhile, Officer Mike discovers something and informs Frank that they have investigated the bank employees, including Eva, who has a criminal record. They also traced her bank account, which had $75,000 deposited from unknown sources, and she used the money to pay hospital bills. At that moment, a new officer arrives from a mission and asks Nick what happened. Nick replies that Nosy's brother was killed in a shootout. Frank asks about Nosy, and Nick informs him that he's the leader of the biggest gang in the area. Frank decides to meet with Nosy, as he might be connected to the brothers. Elsewhere, Jimmy and Mick are held captive, bound, and showing signs of torture. Mick tries to free himself, promising that he'll get out of there. When Nosy and his men enter, Mick admits that he was the one who killed Brill and that the others had nothing to do with it. Jimmy, knowing the bags are filled with money, offers Nosy the money in exchange for letting Eva go, but Nosy refuses, saying that the night will be long. Mick intentionally provokes Nosy to distract him, but Nosy remains calm and tells him that the night is well planned and that each of them will have their own special treatment. He gestures to a large container beside them, explaining that it's filled with sulfuric acid that can turn a person into liquid in minutes. Nosy's assistant slowly pours some acid on the wounds of the injured man, who screams in pain. Mick, furious, threatens Nosy, saying he'll regret not killing him first. Nosy approaches Jimmy, preparing to do the same thing in front of Eva and Mick, but Jimmy uses his leg to kick Nosy away, and Mick frees himself, grabbing a gun from one of the men and shooting Nosy's assistant. He also shoots the pillar to free Jimmy. Jimmy fights Nosy's assistant and uses the St. Jude necklace he wears to strangle him, eventually throwing him into the sulfuric acid container. The necklace falls in with him. Meanwhile, Mick has dealt with the rest of the men and approaches Nosy, who is lying on the ground. He considers making Nosy beg for death before finishing him off. Each of them takes a bag of money and leaves the place. Mick says to his brother Jimmy, "Go with Eva, and if we ever meet again, it will be after we've parted ways as you wanted." Meanwhile, as Frank and his team are on their way to Nosy, they receive a signal about a nearby shootout close to Nosy's house and head there. At that moment, Jimmy and Eva are running down the street, trying to escape, when they suddenly encounter two police officers who order Jimmy to drop his weapon. Eva begs him to comply so that he won't be killed, and he listens to her. One of the officers reports back to headquarters that they've captured a suspect in the bank robbery, and the message reaches Frank as he's on his way. Just before the police can arrest Jimmy, Mick suddenly appears and shoots the officers, killing them. Jimmy asks him, "What brought you back?" Mick responds, "Because you're my brother." As Mick tries to escape, he runs into Frank's car, shoots at it, and disables it, allowing him to flee. On the other side, Jimmy and Eva blend into the crowd, walking calmly to avoid drawing attention. But when Jimmy looks back, he sees Mick engaging in a firefight with a group of police officers. Jimmy gives him a farewell look, torn between staying with him until the end or fleeing for the sake of his daughter. Eva pulls him away, and they escape, while Mick continues his fierce battle with the police. The situation intensifies as Frank and his team join the fight. Mick heads towards a nearby house, continuing to run as Frank and his team pursue him. He moves from one house to another, with them close behind, until he manages to circle around and opens fire, leading to a violent shootout. Eventually, Mike lands a shot on Mick's side, but Mick continues shooting to create an opening for his escape. Frank orders Nick and Mike to flank him from the other side, while he follows directly. Nick tracks the blood trail on the ground, and suddenly Mick appears from behind, threatening him with a gun. Mick forces Nick to walk with him until they come face to face with Mike. Mick demands that Mike back off or he'll kill Nick, but Nick shouts at Mike to shoot and not worry about him. What Mike doesn't expect is that Frank has been quietly approaching from the other side. The moment Mick looks toward Frank, Frank shoots him, and Mick falls to the ground. Frank approaches Mick and asks where his brother Jimmy is. Mick responds, "My brother is dead." These are Mick's last words. At the same time, Jimmy and Eva are on a bus, and Jimmy tells Eva, "Tell our daughter every day that her father loves her." Jimmy gets off the bus, carrying the bag of money, and says goodbye to Eva. On the other side, Frank and his team arrive at Nosey's place to inspect the bodies. The specialist examines the container filled with sulfuric acid, finding only the St. Jude necklace. They realize then that Jimmy is actually dead, as Smalls had previously told them that Jimmy wore that necklace. Frank asks why the necklace didn't dissolve in the acid, and the specialist explains that it's made of silver, which doesn't react with sulfuric acid. 2 days later, Frank visits Ava's home and asks her about the bruises on her face, to which she responds that she fell while coming out of the bathroom. Frank tells her that he knows her daughter underwent surgery a few months ago, which cost a large sum of money. Ava replies that they were lucky to receive crowdfunding from anonymous donors. When he asks about the child's father, she answers that he left them, and she hasn't heard from him since. It's clear that Frank understands everything, but he leaves the house. Mike asks Frank what he plans to do about Eva, and Frank replies, "The whole gang is dead and the money has been recovered. I could charge her and put her in jail, but then her daughter would end up in foster care." Frank decides to leave her alone. Years later, we see Jimmy living in Bolivia with Ava and their daughter, who has grown up just as he promised. They live a happy life together.
If you want interesting movie recaps, like, share, and subscribe to follow us for more movie recaps.